The Dream Portal, a memoir of spiritual transformation, written by Ali Zaid. This book is dedicated to my son, Shanti, his wife, Blair, and my grandchildren, Kaluna and Kimaya. I'm older now. It's strange how the mind starts to reminisce about the past and see experiences in a new light, connected in ways I didn't notice at the time. Early in life, I heard that your destiny is written upon your forehead while you're in your mother's womb. The actual living doesn't always feel so prescribed, but I have become convinced that destiny is real. I once had a dream about a ball rolling down a rail, like in the mousetrap game. The ball passed a mechanism with a click, and then dropped down, only to be picked up and carried up a ladder, where it continued on through many more twists and turns. This is destiny, I've come to understand, and those mechanisms of twists and turns occur through dreams, thoughts, perfect timing, and things that appear to be coincidences. For instance, on the brink of homelessness, I asked a stranger crossing the street about an open apartment. She directed me to an affordable, fully furnished space that had just become vacant that very day. On another occasion, I followed a strong thought to take an unusual direction home and turned just in time to avoid a major accident ahead. In another instance, while searching desperately for a car, after mine broke down, I dreamed of my grandparents standing in front of an unfamiliar row of homes. 2 days later, I drove to check out a car I'd found in the classifieds and saw that the owner lived across from that same row of homes. Before we could even negotiate a price, the owner offered me the car for free. Much of my life has been like that mousetrap ball, unpredictably rolling through obstacle and, unbeknownst to me, also guided in the process. I experienced these tastes of magic, but nothing prepared me for the spiritual transformation that was to come and completely reorient my life. The transformation opened a path in American Indian rights, environmental justice, and documentary filmmaking, uncharted waters for a streetwise black man from Chicago. What follows is the story of that transformation, a massive change that in hindsight serves as preface to my involvement in the making of the documentary film Indian Tears of Love and subsequent decades of educational projects, addiction counseling, and spiritual practice. I grew up in the South. My grandfather was a minister in a local Baptist church and the patriarch of our family. His wife, most of his 6 children, and several grandchildren, including me, lived in the home he built with his own hands after escaping the horrors of sharecropping. My mother surely would have been a preacher had she been able, but instead, she worked as a domestic servant for wealthy white families in the area to raise me and my sister. Though we were raised in the black church, I never really committed to Christianity. My grandparents' spirituality kept us strong, but our lives were hard. And racism only made things more painful. When I was a teenager, my mother's sister and I moved to Chicago with hopes for a better life. There were more opportunities in the city, but few of them were legal. I learned quickly that kindness and compassion were taken as weaknesses in the streets, and that only money garnered respect. Old school hustlers took me under their wings and taught me that to get money, the strong takes from the weak, and the smart takes from the strong. I found my place among the smart, cultivating a range of hustles to execute on Chicago's vast community of evening gamblers. I lost most of my friends and partners to the streets and nearly lost my life on several occasions. But still I carried on, advancing to activities with higher stakes. The streets had become my companion, but I increasingly felt like a black bud that was destined never to blossom into a rose. It wasn't until I got on the wrong side of particularly well-connected and dangerous associates that I really sought to exit the lifestyle. By then, my soul was worn out from years of living in the city, surrounded by so much violence and negativity, and with no knowledge of my purpose in life. The pain became so strong that I knew I had to change or die. The ball continued to roll in my life. One evening in late 1970 Chicago, I read an evening newspaper about a man with 39 doctorate degrees who would be speaking that night, and somehow I felt compelled to go and see him. His name was Richard Buckminster Fuller. I arrived at the venue and was waiting in a long line to get in when a staff woman from the event came to me and said, "Come with me, sir. We've been waiting for you." As I followed her behind the stage, there sat Buckminster Fuller. She introduced me to him as being from a minority newspaper. I must say I was shocked, but I maintained my composure. When I asked if we could meet the next day, he agreed and instructed me to meet him in the Marriott at noon. We shook hands, and I went to take my seat. Little did I know I was in for a 4-hour lecture. The curtains opened, and he began telling his story. A low point in his life, losing his job, his baby dying at childbirth. At that point, he anticipated suicide, but while standing ready to jump in the Chicago River, he had a vision. Water follows a path to the ocean, and so does your life. And from that point on, he understood destiny. The next day we met. We greeted, and he invited me to call him Bucky. Nervously, I admitted that I was not a reporter, but he said, "I know that, but I have something to give you anyway." He gave me 2 research papers he had written. One was his interpretation of the Lord's Prayer about an awesome power that created and controls all things. The other, a paper on the first 3 years of a child's life. He said to me with a sage-like quality, "It's time for your son to be born, and you need to know this." 3 years later, my son was born, and our family moved to Boulder, Colorado. I held in my hand all the instructions Bucky had given me to help start my life. Even though this mousetrap-like ball has taken my life through many twists and turns, I have never forgotten the things he taught me about life lessons and about destiny. And just like Bucky, I also experienced the lowest point in my life. By the mid-1980s, I experienced a difficult divorce and was severely injured on my job. It left me at home every day lying on the couch in pain. I felt tremendous anger growing inside me and took to reading just to calm down I began reading a book called Medicine Woman by Lynn Andrews. Upon finishing the book, I had a striking dream. This dream took place in my living room. I was sitting on my L-shaped sofa, and at one end was this American Indian man. At the other end, I saw myself. As I sat staring into his eyes, he started talking to me. At times, I was laughing. Other times, I was crying. This went on for a while until he vanished. I awakened, startled, with an urgency that I had to find this man. This vision affected me so much that a week later, I began searching for this face, these eyes. Despite my back pain, I roamed around town, even going up to total strangers, asking about this man. One day, while asking an old man, he said to me, "Don't you know? He's looking for you, too. Calm down." About 2 weeks later, on the kind of late evening where you're tired but more hungry, I decided to go out and eat a late dinner. I drove without a clear destination in mind and turned on a street that took me into the mountains. I ended up at a beautiful restaurant called the Swiss Chateau, a place I had visited a few times before. As I walked in, the waitress said, "We're closed." My reply was, "Where is the cook?" The cook came out and said, "I knew one more person was coming in. What would you like?" After ordering, the waitress asked if she could join me, and making small talk, she asked, "Have you read any good books lately?" I told her about the Medicine Woman book, but said that I was looking for a medicine man. She said, "Let me call my girlfriend." She returned with a piece of paper, a phone number written on it. "You asked for him, and here he is. He's coming to town next week." The next morning, I called the phone number. A confused voice answered saying, "I haven't advertised him. How did you get my number?" After I explained, he said, "Send me $40 to help pay for his expenses, and then I'll send you the address where you can meet him." I arrived 15 minutes late on the evening of the event. The private office was filled with people sitting around an elder man in a rocking chair, speaking about something called a sacred sweat lodge. When he removed his glasses to wipe his eyes, we made eye contact for a brief second. Those eyes, they were the same ones from my vision. My heart began to rush. It felt as though I had just stepped through a dream portal, or perhaps he did. I knew my life would not be the same. He pointed at me and said, "Are you ready to sweat?" Not entirely knowing what he meant, but trusting his connection to my dream, I said yes. After his talk, a few of us went to a very isolated farm about 15 miles away. Upon arriving, he asked, "What's your name?" I replied, "Ali." Then he asked, with penetrating eyes, "What took you so long?" suggesting a grander timing of our encounter in life, more than just my late arrival. He continued, "I knew you would come. My name is Robert Gopher from Great Falls, Montana. You will carry the hot rocks." The sweat lodge, I learned, was a sacred ceremony that had been done for thousands of years, since before Europeans invaded this land. The dome-shaped structure was covered in blankets, blocking out all light from the outside. Inside, maybe a dozen men and women sat on either side of a circle. A small pit in the center was filled with glowing red rocks, the ones I had carried from the fire outside. As I looked up, there was a sacred pipe being taken out of a fur pouch. It was used to ask the spirits for assistance and guidance through a spiritual connection that I thought had been lost to humans. The flap to the sweat lodge was closed, sealing in the heat, and Robert began to pray. He dipped what looked like a bundled handful of long grassy plants into a bucket of water and used it to splash water on the rocks 4 times after each prayer and song. A cloud of steam arose and stung our bodies each time he splashed the rocks, making the lodge hotter and hotter. The heat was not unbearable, but the temperature steadily increased throughout his prayers. We took a break for air and water before returning again and again. Each person in the circle took turns with their own round, offering prayers, enduring the heat. The ceremony lasted about 3 hours. As we finished and got out, I lit a cigarette. I had an extra pack to give him, and when he took it, he said, "This means you're asking me to pray for you. Did you know that?" I said no, but asked him to please pray for me because I needed help. He then said to everyone, "I'll be here until Saturday morning. Would any of you like to come back Friday night for another sweat?" Almost everyone said no, except me. It was the moment I felt the small rosebud within finally beginning to blossom into a rose of beauty. I was embarking on a spiritual journey, and what a relief it was to my soul. I returned that Friday. As we closed the flap door and began the sweat lodge ceremony, Robert said, "This one will be done the way we sweat in Montana." He began to pray and splash, singing louder and louder, splashing the rocks much more intensely than before. I knew then that I had to pray with tremendous focus, if only to survive the heat. I heard him say, "The hotter it gets, pray harder." And so I did. I prayed so hard that mentally I went out of my body and was somewhere else. As I looked at me, I had long braids hanging down my face. On my right side was my mother, and on my left side, her mother. In front of me was a face, very large, sitting there, singing a song to me. The next thing I remember was the door opening and the cool air hitting my body as I crawled out. I couldn't wait to share my experience with him. And as I did, he said, "Yes, that's a good vision." Afterwards, we lit a cigarette, and I asked him to come over to my place. He said, "Sure." At the place I stay at, I have to go outside to smoke. I said, "You can smoke all you want at my place, and I need to talk to you." When we arrived at my apartment, I opened the door and said, "Welcome. My place is your place." He walked in, and just like the vision I had of him sitting on my sofa in that one spot, he walked over and sat in that same spot. I walked over and took my spot as it was in the vision. We began to talk and talk and talk. I had so many unanswered questions, and before I knew it, it was 7 in the morning. The sun was rising, and it was time for him to go to the airport. This is how I met Robert Gopher. About 10 days later, I was tired and hungry again, and went out to eat at a local restaurant in Boulder. The waitress sat me in the smoking section. As I sat down and looked around the room, I recognized a face in another booth, sitting with an old man. It was the same face I had seen in my sweat lodge vision, sitting in front of me. I sat nervously while waiting for my food. I got up to go to the bathroom, just to walk back and look at him again. I was so nervous I couldn't say anything. What could I say? Would he understand? Were we supposed to meet? I rushed through my dinner and sat drinking coffee and thinking. I must have also been staring, because when I finally got up to leave, the old man spoke to me and asked if I was an artist. I said no, but introduced myself, and he introduced himself and the man I recognized. They were both American Indian painters. At last, I mustered some courage and began to tell the man with the face from my vision of the sweat lodge I had attended, and that I saw him there singing a song to me. He said, "Did it go like this?" And he began singing, song after song, to see if I recognized one. After the fifth song, I said, "That's the one." He stood up and said, "That song is to call the spirits." After a big hug, he invited me to sit down, and we talked and talked until 9 a.m. the next morning. I invited him to come over and sleep, but he had too much work to do. I asked if we could meet for breakfast the next day, and he agreed. All that night, I dug out old drawings and paintings that I had done years before, without a clear understanding of these pictures' meaning. The next morning, while having breakfast, I shared these things with him. I asked, "What do these pictures that I've drawn represent?" He said, "These are pictures of an old ceremony once done called the ghost dance, and these are ancient spirits." I then showed him the article about a separatist group's proposed division of the U.S. into territories of blacks, whites, and Jews. I said, "Look at this. They are talking about dividing this country." He said, "Oh, don't worry. If anything happens, I'll meet you there." And he pointed to a spot on the map. I asked about the location, and he responded, "Home of the Anasazi Indians. This is Zion National Park. Mother Earth has spiritual openings, and this is one of them." After we finished breakfast, we walked to the car to say goodbye. The next month was my son's birthday. I was exhausted after the party that night and went out to relax and shoot pool. I walked into a bar with 7 tables and noticed a guy shooting by himself. I asked if I could play him, and we began shooting. I couldn't help noticing the intensity of the game. We each had just one turn before the game was over. Afterwards, he introduced himself and asked, "Where did you come from before Boulder?" I said, "Palestine." "Do you know where that is?" He did and asked what it was like there. "Well, it's very powerful. A thought becomes reality there very fast." He said, "Oh, I've been to a place like that, Zion National Park." Suddenly I remembered the earlier conversation. I asked him to tell me about the place. As he began speaking of his experience there, chill bumps came on his arms and his voice trembled. I knew then that he had experienced something there that had deeply and profoundly changed his life. An experience of a lifetime, he concluded. I knew our meeting at the bar that night was not an accident. and I couldn't wait to visit Zion myself. I told him as much as we shook hands to leave. I remember the look of kinship and anticipation in his eyes as he said, "Good luck." The following Monday, despite having only $55 in my bank account, I made arrangements to fly to Zion the next day. I called all of my friends to borrow the camping equipment. At the end of the day, while trying to figure out a way to pay for the trip, I went to my mailbox. There waiting for me was a check for $1,200. After waiting 9 months for it, there it was, on that day, at that time. I knew then I had stepped into the perfect time. I couldn't explain why or how. I flew into St. George, Utah the next morning, with no real plan or agenda. I stayed the night in a motel, and the following morning, I rented a car and began driving to Zion. On the way, I noticed how similar the terrain and mountains in this area were to Mesa Verde in southwestern Colorado. When I arrived in Zion National Park, I stood in awe at the magnificent red and orange-hued mountains, rising high enough to touch the clouds. I drove around until dark, listening to my thoughts and looking for a place to camp. At last, I found a perfect spot, a circle of rocks just large enough for me to sleep in. I noted the location and drove further down the road to a restaurant with a phone booth outside. I decided to call the artist from my Sweat Lodge vision who first told me about this place. When he answered the phone, I said, "I'm here at Zion," and asked if there was anything special I should know. "Yes," he said, "make an offering to the spirits, put down some food, and place 1 cigarette and matches at each of the 4 directions." I thanked him for the advice and left to go eat. I ordered 2 dinners and ate a little of each. After getting a container to go, I returned to the circle of stones to camp out. After laying my sleeping bag in the circle, I said a prayer and began putting a cigarette and book of matches in each direction. I placed the container of food near my feet, opened it, and put a fork and spoon inside. I then climbed into my sleeping bag, gazing up at the stars. Thoughts started racing through my mind, and I suddenly became afraid. This was my first time ever camping alone in the mountains, and I was overwhelmed by my vulnerability. I began to pray. It was all I could do to try and calm the anxiety. As I did, I noticed the mountain on my right and the full moon rising above it. The play of light and shadows on the mountain began revealing contours of strange shapes, faces, and animals. I watched them change and shift with the moon's movement until I finally fell asleep. I woke up the next morning to a chill in the air and birds singing. As I looked around, I noticed 1 cigarette was gone and exactly half the food was missing. The way that exactly half the food had disappeared was odd, and I figured, oh, they know I'm here. The spirits have accepted my offering. But then the gravity of this new reality hit me, and I became very scared. I immediately jumped up, threw my sleeping bag in the car, and left. I calmed down at the restaurant. After having breakfast, I asked the waitress, "That mountain down the road on the right, with the white flat face. What is it called? She said, Oh, that one is called the Great White Thorn. The somewhat fitting name relaxed me, and I continued to feel I was in the right place. As I left and began walking with my sweetgrass in hand, I noticed a sign, Angel's Landing. I should go there, I thought. I began walking up the mountain, steadily climbing higher into an area of vast beauty when I came upon a cave. I went in and took out my sweetgrass to pray and asked for guidance. Afterwards, I returned to the path and braced for a series of steep zigzag turns as I walked my way toward the top of Angel's Landing. At an edge along the way stood a unique tree, and a voice suggested I should stop there to pray again, and I would receive a gift. I did so, and the wind intensified as I prayed. I finished and continued on until I finally arrived at the peak. As I walked to the edge, atop Angel's Landing, I fell to the ground with a profound feeling of humility. I realized how truly small I was, just like a leaf on a tree, and the wind could blow me over at any moment. And there, all around me, was such enormous size and beauty. I felt my place in the universe. I was no more than a blade of grass who depended on the Creator for my life. It was my mistake to believe I was in control when I was not. I was a part of all and connected to the cycle of life. As I began to walk down Angel's Landing, I moved slowly, taking in the beauty and midday scents as if with sharpened, freshly awakened senses. When I reached the bottom, I had to cross a creek. Again, a voice-like feeling told me to stop, walk in the creek, and receive a gift. I did so and found a beautiful stone. Grateful, I walked to my car, dripping wet, and began driving away. I had an acute awareness of faces of women, men, and animals in the mountains I passed. As I drove up the canyon and through several tunnels, a voice again instructed that I stop at an upcoming curve and visit the mountain to my left. I pulled over, and as I walked toward the mountain, it seemed as if I had stepped on an electric bolt. I began to cry with a whirlwind of emotions. Why did you bring me here? I asked the Creator. Why can't I be normal like everyone else? I calmed down and prayed with gratitude for my experiences and for my beautiful son and family. But I started crying again, more fiercely, and filling with anger at the way people had treated me at my job and elsewhere when I had only tried to help them. I went into a rage of crying and screaming. I picked up a stone and began scratching the mountain. After the rage was over, I looked up at the scratches and saw that I had made words on the mountain. Wolf bear. Surprised, I asked, Is this why you brought me here? Is this my name? I began to calm down and wipe my eyes. I like it, I said. Thank you. I made an offering, returned to my car, and drove through the mountains, listening to a cassette tape of Flute and Heartbeat. I looked out the window in awe of creation and in awe of this powerful place and the indigenous people who once lived here, and recognized its power. After a week of so many beautiful experiences in Zion, I decided to go back home. I figured that I had completed my journey, and received all my spiritual gifts. So I returned the rental car and booked a flight to leave the next morning. That night, as I lay in a motel room bed, the experiences of the week and of the months leading to it replayed through my mind all over again. All I could think to say was, why me? Who would believe me? The next morning, with a 6:45 a.m. flight, I returned to the airport, ready to fly home. I boarded the plane and sat looking out the window, remembering everything that had happened. We took off, but suddenly, only a few minutes into the flight, the pilot came over the intercom with a strange message. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we are experiencing engine problems and will have to return to the airport." Immediately, I thought, so why am I returning? I must have forgotten something, or we wouldn't be going back. I must go back to Zion again. We returned, and as I stood in line, waiting to cancel my reservation, a lady behind me said, "Why, are you canceling your reservation?" I said, "I don't really know. I think I must return back to Zion." She then asked, "What kind of book is that in your pocket?" "It's Lame Deer, Seeker of Vision," I replied. "Oh," she said, "if you're reading that book, you must go to the valley. Hang on, let me call my girlfriend." When she returned, she said, "Be here at the airport in the morning at 6:45 a.m., and you'll fly into Page, Arizona. My girlfriend, Bonnie, will meet you there to arrange for an air taxi to take you into Monument Valley." I said, "Sure, thank you so much." For some reason, I knew this was where I had to go. The experience was still unfolding. The next morning, I boarded the flight to Page, Arizona. When I arrived, I saw a black woman working at the airport. She was the first other black person I had seen on my journey, and I asked, what brought her to this area? With a knowing look, she answered, "You'll know why when you return from the valley." Shortly after, Bonnie walked up to me and asked if I was Ali. She introduced herself and said that the air taxi was ready. Aboard the small plane, I sat looking out the window at the strange landscape below. I could only imagine what the moon must look like here. The land was so different, this home of the Navajo Indians. The pilot began to point out sights like Rainbow Bridge, a natural bridge, Lake Powell, sand dunes, and mountains that seemed to have just jetted straight up out of the ground when they formed. We landed on an unpaved dirt runway, and a bus was waiting to take us on a tour. As we drove across the beautiful, strange land on the bus, the tour guide asked me, "What brought you here?" I replied, "I don't know. The Spirit sent me here." With a look of understanding, he said, "When the tour is over, we'll go in my truck and drive until you find out why." I was grateful for his kindness and the opportunity to see more of the land. While riding and looking out the window, I remember thinking that of all of the places on the planet I had seen or even heard of, nothing could compare to this place. The landscape was peppered with mountains of otherworldly shapes, strange and beautiful, across what seemed to be barren land. I saw homes miles apart, people herding sheep with dogs, and goats lazily eating brush. I wondered how anyone or anything could live out here without lakes or rivers, trees or grass. All I saw was mountains, sagebrush, sand, and red dirt. Finally, the tour was over, and the guide and I ate lunch together and then went to his truck. He asked where we should go, and I said, "To the place you don't take the tours." We drove further into the land, watching a storm moving across on the horizon. Sheep periodically crossed the road, usually with a dog not far behind, who seemed to be providing protection. As we passed more mountains, the guide casually asked, "So how is it living in both worlds?" I replied, "I think that's why I'm here. I'm out of balance." He drove on further, but then stopped to show me a mountain called the Sun's Eye. At the top, rocks formed the shape of an eye and looked all the more majestic when the sun's rays passed through it. At the base were ancient petroglyph drawings of sheep and other symbols. He told me the drawings were over 3,000 years old and were the story of his people. We continued driving, sometimes stopping by different homes to greet residents. We visited one old woman who lived in a small circular home that seemed made of mud and thatch called a hogan. As I walked into her hogan, I noticed that this home made from the land was very clean and instilled a feeling of peace and calmness. There was a small bed on the side, beans piled in a corner, some clothes, a candle, some blankets with unique designs, and other items that seemed spiritual in nature. There was no refrigerator or even electricity. I remember seeing a coat with decorative buttons made of dimes and quarters, as if to show she placed little value on trinkets of the material world. They were truly people of the land, dependent on the Creator for their survival. It all seemed like a different world, but it was a world that I felt a strong need to see and touch. As we drove on, the sun began to set, and a cold chill fell on the land. The guide asked where I would stay that night, and I said I would just camp out on the land somewhere. "No," he said, "it's too cold out here. We'll go into the town of Kayenta. You can get a room there." He decided to take a back road into town, and as we drove down the bumpy dirt road, an extraordinary mountain came into view. Suddenly I felt like I had crossed into a time warp. My heart began to rush with a very nervous energy. The closer we came to it, it was calling me. The enchanted magnetism was so intense. I told the guide to pull over, and I jumped out of the truck. I began running to the mountain. The closer I got, I could see memory flashes of the old trails of the land, the peoples who made homes there, the pottery designs, and so much more. I yelled out, "I'm at home! I'm at home! I finally made it home!" I began crying and laughing, overwhelmed by flooding emotions I had never felt before. I was running so fast in the late dusk darkness that I tripped over something and fell hard to the rocky ground. I barely registered pain and instead fumbled for the sacred sweet grass that I remembered was in my coat pocket. I lit it and began to smudge and pray, thanking the Creator for bringing me home. While praying, I could hear my friend's footsteps walking up behind me. He said, "Where did you learn to smudge that way?" "That is how we smudge." I told him I had no idea. Then he said, "I know how you feel. The same thing happened to me at Ship Rock. That's the twin to this mountain We call this Eagle Mountain, but they call it El Capitan. I looked up and said, "Well, if you are attracted to that mountain, and I am attracted to this mountain, that must mean..." We looked at each other and both yelled, "We're brothers!" We started to hug each other and jump up and down like two little kids, laughing and crying, saying, "Yes, yes, yes." This was how I met Roland. After the excitement was over, he said, "Come sit in the truck. It's cold out here." We made our way back to the truck and sat in silence, warm in our hands in the heated air. Roland turned on the radio, and the music blaring through the speakers was a rock song called Deja Vu. I could hardly believe it. My heart rushed even faster because I knew I had reached an undeniably spiritual perfection of timing. Everything had come so perfectly together. As I stared at the deep shapes and shadows of the mountain, I started to make out an image of a man and a small boy. I got out of the truck to see better, and Roland got out too. I pointed toward the top of the mountain where, coming down the center, was the image of a slender man holding a pouch with the 4-direction design on it, and behind him was a small boy. Roland said, "Ali, that is you and your son. It even looks like you. I've been out here all my life, and I've never seen that before. You're right. This is your mountain." I can't begin to describe the massive explosion that was occurring in my brain and body. It felt as if I was experiencing the birth of the universe. As we walked back to the truck, I could not speak. I could hear him saying something about a cup of coffee, and soon after we were sitting at a restaurant with coffee in hand. A quick vision flashed in my mind of a little boy coming up to me and asking if I wanted to meet his father. Within seconds, a little boy did walk up to me and asked if I wanted to meet his dad. I said I would. And his father, the owner of the restaurant, walked out smiling to shake my hand. After our friendly exchange, I thought to myself, yes, I understand. I understand. I was still in a dazed state of shock when Roland said he would drop me off at a hotel to get a room for the night. I checked in and walked into my room. The heat felt good, and on the wall hung a huge photograph of a blanket, intricately woven with colorful threads, branching out to a flower of each color. It was so beautiful, I couldn't resist taking a picture of it. As I laid on the bed staring at the picture, my mind was rushing faster than the speed of light about everything I had seen and done, until finally I fell asleep. The next morning, there was an early knock at the door. It was Roland. "Ready for breakfast?" he asked. While we ate, I told him that I had to go out to the mountain again to see it in the full light of day. We headed out, and as we approached, I prayed and asked the Spirit if I could have a rock. When we arrived, I started running up the mountain until a voice in my mind said, "Stop and look down." When I looked down, I gasped at seeing the most beautiful and unique rock I had ever encountered. It had such strange colors and designs. I thanked the spirits for the gift, held the precious memento in both hands, and stared at the mountain for one last time before saying a prayer and leaving. When I returned to the truck, I asked Roland to take a picture of me and my mountain. With a sense of closure seeping into my thoughts, I asked him if a plane was coming today. He said, "Yes, in 45 minutes," and offered to drive me to the airport. I was ready to leave because I knew I had gotten what I needed from the trip. At the airport, Roland and I looked at each other with tears in our eyes. We said our goodbyes, and I boarded the plane back to Page. I arrived in Page, and as I walked through the small airport, I saw the same black woman I had met earlier that week. She was looking at me and smiling. I walked up to her and said, "Yes, I understand now." As we chatted, she offered, "There's a flight leaving for Flagstaff in 10 minutes. You want to catch it?" The thought of extending my trip further seemed unnecessary, but then I also wanted some more time to process things. "Sure," I said. "I have never been there before, and I could get a bus and take my time going back to Boulder." I arrived in Flagstaff, Arizona, with my mind still a roaring ocean of thoughts. I bought a bus ticket to Denver and was happy to have the extra time to think. Since the bus did not leave for another 7 hours, I decided to put my bags in a locker and tour the town. I walked from street to street, meandering through different shops, when I came across one with bars on the doors and windows that obstructed a view inside. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked in. There were many shelves of mason jars, all filled with various roots, herbs, and infusions. I greeted the clerk, who shared, "You see my daughter over there? She's 18. I brought her up on these herbs. It's a part of the traditions of the Navajo Indians." As I turned around to greet the daughter, I saw a woman next to her that I recognized. It was Brooke Medicine Eagle. I had gone to a workshop she led in Boulder 4 years prior that had helped me start thinking about the earth as a living being. While I have since learned that many of her teachings misrepresented indigenous knowledge for commercial success, her impact on my early growth was positive, and I was excited to see her. I asked her, "Do you remember me?" and described the workshop she had done in Boulder. She said, "Yes, of course. What brings you to Flagstaff?" I asked her to sit while I told her the story. As I began to talk, she took out some yarn and tools and began weaving a decorative hairpiece of many colors. While discussing my experiences, I described a moment in Zion when I was trying to visit a site that resembled an opening into the Mother Earth. Before I could continue, she said, "Stop. I'm hearing that I should call my sister." When she returned, she said, "Last night my sister had a dream that she had entered Mother Earth through her vagina in a pool of water. Does that make sense?" I said, "Yes. I don't believe it. Look at this picture." I pulled out a book about Zion that I had purchased and pointed to a black and white photo of the narrow site. At its closest point, an opening in the narrow gorge bore resemblance to a vagina, as a stream of water flowed below. "I was unable to reach this place," I explained, "because it was closed due to flooding." She looked at the picture and said, "You're right, that's it. It's just like her dream." I finished telling her the rest of my story, and we exchanged phone numbers to keep in touch. We hugged to say goodbye, and she said, "My prayers are with you." I felt more secure after sharing my experiences, affirmed that I was not insane and that others also understood that there is another reality out there. On the bus ride back to Colorado, I was trying to calm down and absorb all that I had learned and experienced. Several passengers tried talking to me, but I was unable to relate to their conversation. Instead, I sat back in my seat, staring out the window, and fell into a deep meditation while listening to the constant sound of the tires rolling. The most profound questions in my mind were, why me? Why now? I pondered, did I ask for this? Or was it just my time to learn? As I recalled the experience and how perfect it was, I started thinking about my mother and grandfather and all of the prayers they had done for me since I was young. Prayers that I would one day understand. Suddenly I remembered a night from when I was a young boy living in Mississippi with my mother and grandparents. I was fast asleep when my grandfather screamed awake at 2 a.m., and the noise woke me up. I asked him what was wrong, and he calmly replied, "Do you want to go with me?" I agreed, still unsure about what was going on. We left the house and started walking through the summer night's mist. We walked for about half an hour. As we approached a well-lit area of buildings with large glass windows, the wind began blowing very strong in a circular motion. Up ahead, I could see a small whirlwind with paper and trash caught in the middle of it. We walked forward, following the swirl as it moved further down the street. When we caught up with it, my grandfather looked down and said, "There it is." As he reached down, I looked and saw a $50 bill that the wind was blowing against the bottom of a glass window. I was baffled. He pulled it off the window and said, "All right, we can go back home now." I remember asking, "Big Daddy, how did you know that would be there?" He said, "Just serve the Creator, and one day you'll understand." I slipped out of the flashback, wondering why I was thinking of that now. Did my grandfather have a hand in my recent experience? Was he still helping me? I was 10 years old when that happened. Suddenly I felt his presence and knew he was still with me. It was a beautiful day when I returned home to Boulder. I couldn't wait to develop the many rolls of film I had shot. I had to see it all again. I went to the local photo shop where a friend I had not seen in many years was working. I began telling him about my trip, and he offered to develop the films himself because he wanted to see why I was so excited. That evening, with a forecast of snow outside, I sat at home holding my rock and going through informational books I had purchased about the areas I visited. I was remembering the sights I saw and the many faces I had met along the way who had acted as guides to assist me through a delicate transition of time. Suddenly the phone rang. To my surprise, it was Robert. "Hi, Ali. I'm in Boulder with some friends. Can we camp out with you tonight?" he asked. I was more than happy to accommodate. I had forgotten that we were in the middle of a snowstorm, but nevertheless left to pick them up. When we all returned to my home and everyone was comfortable, Robert asked what I had been doing lately. I said, "I just returned from a trip that was out of this world, and I would love to share it with you all." They settled back and I began telling the story of everything that had happened since the last sweat lodge. When I finished, I showed Robert the rock from Eagle Mountain. As he looked it over, he asked me to light some smudge. He began talking about this rock and what it meant. As Robert held the rock in his hands, he said, "Remember in the sweat lodge, we spoke about the rock as the body of our ancestors, connecting us to this planet floating in space, and how it related to the offering we make to those who have passed on?" I said, "Yes." He continued, "Well, this is it. Look, you can even see the flesh and blood in it." I felt like I was looking at the rock for the first time. Below the hard gray surface were deep flesh tones, as if preserved in time, with quivering red lines, resembling veins in the body embedded underneath. So much started to make sense to me now. But still I wondered, why had they, the spirits, given it to me? Was it a reminder of the past and the future to come? I held the gifted rock tightly in both hands as we prayed to give thanks for this experience. As we ended the night, I could hear the cold wind blowing outside. I lay in my bed with ideas, experiences, and memories flashing across my mind like fireworks. I thought to myself that the lessons of spirituality I had learned must be part of those age-old questions. Why was I born? And what is my purpose? I pondered levels of growth more broadly and remembered a conversation about chakras I had years before while traveling abroad. An elder had linked chakras to stages in life, relating lower chakras to base urges around sexuality, ego, and accomplishment. I felt I had lived and moved through these stages and was finally experiencing the higher levels related to dreams, timing, and unified will. I was witnessing my dreams become a reality and understanding how my thoughts could affect the energies and karma circulating in life. I was also experiencing timing, perfect, profound, universal timing. The lingering question I had was about one will, where the intentions of the spiritual world and one's own self become aligned. What is it that I want to do and that the Creator wants me to do? I wondered as I fell asleep. I knew the answers would come. In the coming days and weeks, my dreams increased tenfold. The first dream I had was about a mesa located below the Flatirons Mountains in Boulder. I stood at the mesa, watching clouds move between mountain peaks, and turned to images of different spirit moving northward. I searched for the spot where I stood in the dream for 3 weeks, and finally I found it. I lit some smudge and had prayer there, giving thanks for the dream and the verification that I was in the right place. Since then, I have made it a habit to follow through in matters of spiritual communication, whether it is from dreams, intuitions, or simply thoughts. The following year, my search for a unified will took shape when I went to visit Robert at his home in Great Falls, Montana. The day I arrived, he said, "Today we'll go and meet your brother. He is soft-spoken like you, Ali." Trusting his intuition, I accompanied Robert on a drive to Fort Belknap Indian Reservation, about 40 miles from the Canadian border. He introduced me to Joe Azure when we arrived. We spent several hours talking. They discussed how Pegasus Gold Mining Company was operating in mountains near the reservation, using cyanide and other poisonous chemicals to process tons of ore from dead mines to extract trace amounts of gold. They had been deeply saddened by the destruction of the mountains and had started noticing many people and animals around the reservation becoming ill or found dead. They suspected that cyanide and other poisons were leaking into the community's water supply. We drove around the reservation to meet with people who had been sick or affected by the poisons. I was totally shocked by the devastation that the mining wrought on their land and water system. After a few days of this, Robert told me, "Ali, you will be the connection between our world in Indian country and your world, where we need to find help and resources to stop this." At the end of our visit, we did a sacred sweat lodge. I returned to Boulder, knowing this was the reason for my transformation, and that Spirit had chosen this destiny for me. Over the next several years, Robert, Joe, and I worked with countless others to coordinate a grassroots effort to stop Pegasus Gold. In Boulder, the Land and Water Fund agreed to assign a young lawyer, Paul Zog, to sue the company for violation of the Clean Water Act, and we helped collect evidence for the case. To put public pressure on the company and raise awareness about their abuses, we wanted to make a documentary film. Unable to find any willing filmmakers, I bought a video camera, checked out filmmaking books from the local library, and began frequently traveling to Fort Belknap to collect footage of the environmentally devastating mining and to interview sick and affected reservation residents. The spiritual transformation that the experiences in Mesa Verde, Zion National Park, and Monument Valley introduced into my life continue to thread into every facet of our fight against Pegasus destructive mining. Our work was shaped as much by dreams and visions, spiritual messages from performance ceremonies, and the divinely perfect timing of chance encounters, as much as it was by any planning we deliberated over. I would not have understood or even listened to such guidance and interventions from the spirit world without that foundational transformation. But with it, every day became touched by flashes of spirit and a dance between the unseen and the visible. One memorable day in the late 1980s stands out for the particularly strong spiritual experience that emboldened our resolve to keep fighting to protect Fort Belknap. We were early in our efforts and eager for direction. After spending months praying for assistance through several sweat lodges and meeting people around the reservation, we organized a 2-day conference at the Chief Nosey Recreation Center in Fort Belknap to bring everyone together for a discussion. On the first day, a community elder named Wolf Child led us all on a tour of 8 sacred sites around Fort Belknap, beginning with the Chief Nosey gravesite near the Recreation Center. Chief Nosey, revered as an ancestor of great respect, was an Assiniboine leader who helped secure much of the reservation land for his people. White government agents called him Nosey because of his persistence in learning about the agent's true intentions and plans regarding his people. At the above-ground grave site, Wolfchild led a prayer to Chief Nosy and asked for help on how to stop the mining company. Robert, Joe, me, and the rest of the conference group then spent the whole day following Wolfchild and learning about the history and significance of sites around the land. We returned to the recreation center that evening, and after eating dinner, Robert went outside to start his car and get ready to leave. As dusk was giving way to night, I walked outside and found that Robert had lost his keys and was frantically searching through his car, nearly tearing out the back seat in the process. Everyone was concerned because the keys could have been lost anywhere along the extensive trek from which we had just returned. Plus, it was getting dark. I didn't know what to say or do. My mind began to pray as I found myself walking up the hill to Chief Nosy's grave. I was giving thanks to the Creator for a beautiful day, but also explaining that Robert had lost his car keys and that we needed help to find them. I prayed to Chief Nosy as well, first asking him not to scare me, and then seeking help with the keys. As I approached the grave at the top of the hill, I remembered that I had a small flashlight on my keychain. While shining the light across the tall grass, I saw something glimmer. There were Robert's keys, sitting just on top of the knee-high grass, as if they had been gently placed there. I was amazed, not knowing what to say, except thank you, over and over, as I ran down the hill. I will never forget the look of surprise on Robert's face when I gave him his keys and explained what happened. He said, "Those above us heard you, Ali. Thank you. Don't try to figure it out. Just accept Creator's blessing and stay humble." We never spoke of it again, but the experience affirmed the mysterious ways Spirit worked and confirmed that the spirits were with us in the project we were embarking on. After 3 years of hard work and help from the Creator and the spirit world, we finally completed the documentary film, Indian Tears of Love. After a premiere in Boulder and in Great Falls, we hosted special screenings for the Fort Belknap Tribal Council, Montana politicians, and other key constituents to build increasing public pressure around the lawsuit. The film contributed to forcing Pegasus into what became an unprecedented, monumental legal settlement favoring the reservation. The ultimately successful effort to stop Pegasus was recently documented at Red Thunder Oral History Project.org, an online resource created with funding from the MacArthur Foundation. Robert and I went on to make many more films and other projects together. In 1992, we pooled our resources to make a second documentary film, Extinct Civilization, about the horrors committed against American Indians for the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. In the winter of 1998, the saddest day of my life came when Robert Gopher was called home. I can't explain the pain I felt. My brother Robert, the spiritual leader who lifted my soul from its darkest place, had passed away. I remember my last conversation with my brother Robert before he passed. He said, "You must live with devotion to the Creator, who made and controls all things, which you can't see or touch, and yet is there and able to serve you. So always stay humble with a childlike spirit of knowing that those above see and hear you, You're never alone. That which created this universe and all the beautiful planets and Mother Earth also made you. You have nothing to fear. I continue to find this to be true. Some people who have had similar kinds of experiences are afraid to speak about them, and may even be ridiculed by family and friends if they do. I must say I was very reluctant to share this adventure too. But this was the beginning of my spiritual journey, an awakening, for better or for worse. And this journey continues with divine guidance, like the ball of my earlier dreams, still rolling through the twists and turns of the universe. There is another reality, one that you can't see or touch, and yet it is there. The conditions of our lives often keep us too busy or distracted to feel the connection, but the connection remains, and the universal rhythm is ready for you, as it is for us all, if we listen and follow through. The Dream Portal, written by Ali Zaid. Copyright 2025. Ali Zaid. All rights reserved. Cover design by Shanti Zaid. Editing by Katia Jasaka, Susana Escalante, and Shanti Zaid. Formatting and printing by Corazon Printing, Broomfield, Colorado. First edition, 2025. Thank you for listening to The Dream Portal. There is a consciousness that exceeds our space and time. Attach yourself only to that consciousness, spirit,